All right, our next speaker is Margot Brunn. It's a conservator for the Royal Alberta Museum, a provincial museum covering Alberta's provincial museum covering Alberta's cultural and human history, biological diversity, and geological and paleontological history. As object explorer, she has expanded her field of training for furniture and ethnographic conservation for over 25 years. It's published in a range of topics arising from her work. All right.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason. You will notice that the title is a little different. I was overly optimistic about the project. I thought that, well, I did have a deadline of spring 2013, but it's way behind. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. Oops. Okay, so the outline, I'll talk about the background, the artist, the commission, design, condition, a little bit about the roadblocks for the project and the team. This is the fountain. That's the image of 2012. At first sort of came to my attention, has been in 2003 when the museum started planning redevelopment. And the landscaping for the site did not include the fountain, and it was to be dismantled and taken to the warehouse. There were jokes about the dump, but it would have been the warehouse. So I became interested in this project, and it's one of the sculptures where that is always sitting there, but there is no plaque, there's no description, there is no information whatsoever. And even though it's been popular, there was no information about it. So the local paper had a readers' contest about favorite outdoor sculptures. So I managed to get the fountain onto the front page, and from there, a few years later, there was an article. I wrote an article for the museum journal, the museum, magazine. And, no good deed goes unpunished. So a year later or so, it became an Alberta infrastructure project. And from there on, it became a little bit more serious for me. Am I doing this? Okay, this way. So the fountain was commissioned in 1965, and it was made for the centennial of Canada. And it was commissioned by cabinet, and the information that we have was, the provincial cabinet members were impressed and were supportive of the fountain. I'm going to continue to do that. The artist was Ole Holmsten. He was a Swedish sculptor who immigrated in the late 1950s to Alberta. His work, he worked mostly in granite and bronze, and he became an instructor in Alberta, and he taught figure sculpting, and he was quite influential for the 20 years or so that he worked in Alberta. The province commissioned several other artwork by him, and these were mostly bronzes and concrete, and these were mostly figures, life-size figures. He also created the reliefs for the new museum. Sorry. Okay. So this fountain is located in the Government House Park. This is a large site. It's about 12 acres, and it has natural tree groves for weddings and graduation photography mostly, but generally it has very large plazas that are generally empty. It has an Edwardian garden, and so over the last few decades, 2 decades possibly, it has very minimally be maintained. So you have various, you can see by the dates, the original construction was in 1913 when the Government House was built. Then various styles. The new museum was built in 1967. There are carving one stone. Okay, I'm going to have to get my water. Sorry. So there are carving of petroglyphs from southern Alberta. There is an iron statue by a local artist, professor. There is another large bronze by Holmsten. And that was it until the 1980s when the site had a totem pole given to it during the World University Games. Then there is a Korean pavilion, and we can see that. This is the site, the totem pole, the Korean pavilion, the Government House, somewhere there's the carriage house, the lumberjack, another Holmsten, the storyteller, a large iron abstract that was left from a show artist. Didn't pick it up, and the petroglyph. Just there's no sign. We don't know who did it or who we should call. And the petroglyphs, and a very large plaza there that is generally empty. And in the center is the fountain. The fountain is 16 feet tall, and it's actually the most popular feature in the park. And it is on the south side, and it sort of anchors the heterogeneous, elements of that large space. Its design was a different departure from the artist's previous work, which was all traditional figure based. And let's see what is next. And it was commissioned as public art, but it was never accessioned. None of the artwork on the ground that belong to the province and that have been purchased, publicly funded by the province, are accessioned. But it was created for this particular space, and it has that public function. And the artist himself was influential in the art of the art history of Alberta, and its 1960 vision. The optimism of the era, he represented that very well. So it is also, it has an educational kind of a purpose. It draws together. The artist's intent was to point to the river, the North Saskatchewan River, that is just south of the sculpture, and also connects it with the museum where the historic and the natural history of Alberta is displayed. So the condition of the sculpture, the bronze work is dull, but there is actually very little staining. In the 1980s, it had been worked, it had been repaired. The form, the bronze does not fit completely into the cradle of the cement, so there are gaps in between it, and apparently there had been birds nesting, and the solution was to fill the gaps with polyurethane foam. So that then has created the staining that you see, the bright staining of the bleached out area. The foam is now totally crumbled, but the runoff has bleached. The cement here's a bit better. So it's a cement base with a very thin stucco overcoat, and it has various losses, and it has tenting, but generally just on the northeast side. There is actually very little staining otherwise on the stucco. It is it is exposed to the wind and rain, and it's actually a little weathered, but it doesn't have a lot of lichens or things on it. Here, this was during the winter when we took a hijacker up to see what is happening in the hollow on the top. I was concerned about the stability of it, and before I knew how to get into it, and because of the generally the hairline cracks, and I didn't know how deep they would go, or if the interior of the sculpture was affected. So a little close up, it really is the hairline cracking, and then this is from the top view, very little lichen on there, so overall it's fairly clean. This is just ice that was partly brushed off. So other than the cracks, which I didn't know what they meant, the surface seemed fairly stable. We did some cleaning tests. A dry ice company offered to do some tests for us, and but that, it did work on the darker biological areas, but not really. It didn't work quickly enough and gently enough, so there was abrasion of the stucco, and so this was not a cleaning solution. This is in the underside, the belly of the sculpture, and you see the water spout. The water comes out up here, splashes against the shield, and then runs off the granite base. Again, fairly substantial damage down here. When we dismantled that, the spout was full of pebbles, and we thought, children have put these little stones into it because the fountain has not had water in it for the last 2 years, and this was also one of the reasons why it needed the water, because just to protect, water is a protection against people climbing up and pulling things apart. But we did find out that for some reason, which I don't really understand, all the irrigation spouts contain pebbles and they need to be cleaned out. This is what our landscaping people told me, that every year they have to clean out the irrigation heads that for some reason are full of pebbles, and this was one of it. So now we knew why there was just a trickling of water coming out, just like we heard before. The project team and scope of work, so we had the infrastructure, Alberta infrastructure project manager, we had an architect, we had the water engineer, we had the general contractor, the facility manager who is funding the project, we have the site property manager who looks after the maintenance, and then it was me. So I basically was there by default, and you can see the composition of the team why that is, because there was no preservation architect involved in that. There was no curator or historian who would actually do the research. Infrastructure was doing feasibility studies for their work, but there was simply nobody else to do any kind of background or even looking at how the fountain fits into the site, or give it some weight. The infrastructure, the money that was put towards was $520,000, and at the present this stands at $493,000, and that was all. That only covered the mechanical, basically the mechanical, the water circulation and the tiles of the pool. So there were major roadblocks in that project. One was that this was really an infrastructure project. It was funded through infrastructure. It is a huge department, of course, versus Alberta Culture that I work for. And but the major roadblock was, well, whose fountain is it? Who is really responsible for it? Who does it belong to? Because it was not accessioned as an artwork. My museum said, well, we are not responsible because it's not accessioned. It's not in our collection. The infrastructure people have their mandate, and they say, well, we're looking after it. It's the maintenance that we're responsible for. And that has not been resolved, and it's that sticky point that the province hasn't had an inventory of outdoor sculpture fountain or not since 1980, and that there is, even though there is on paper, there is actually a person responsible or a program responsible, the Historical Resources Foundation. In reality, this is not. This has just not been worked out. So the directors are still apparently discussing who will pay for it. And as of my conservation budget is $7,000 for the year, so it simply did not cover that. Well, the original proposal was to patch the losses and to clean the bronzes in situ. But in the meantime, we've decided that this was just going to be a gap measure, and that something more substantial is needed. So first of all, the responsibilities. And so we looked at, I needed to look at the mandates and really the infrastructure mandate. It's landscaping, it's a system, it's public safety, and maintaining the pool basin, which they actually hadn't done in 2 decades. And even though the government house is a registered Alberta historic resource, which does have the funding of Historical Resource Foundation, it's their 100th anniversary, so there's quite a lot of restoration going on. They simply were not prepared at this point to fund something that was not in there on their list. So this is what I'm working on, and this is why I'm so excited to be here in this conference, is that we need to have a better approach to these kind of projects. And I think I've already heard quite a bit that will help me do that. So not only that, but we also have, going back a little bit, the site has a long history of being supported, being unsupported. There was a previous fountain in 1917 that was dismantled before the abstract fountain was built and when the new museum was built. I found these drawings, but there was actually, the fountain was actually there. Documentation is very, very hard to come by. I went through the provincial archives and went boxes and boxes of government records, but actual actual construction details are, it takes a full-time job to find those. And this was a volunteer job. Okay, so health regulations. I beat myself up after I put this picture into the museum, the Mammoth Track, the museum magazine, because I thought, okay, now I did it. I actually showed people. This is the daughter of a colleague, curatorial colleague, who got married at the museum, and she and her husband were taking pictures in the pool, and she said, here, you have a great picture. And I thought, wow, the pool is used, the pool is, people are interested, and it seemed like a wonderful picture to include for the friends. And after I did that, I sort of beat myself up, because now it became a health issue, because I actually had a record of somebody stepping into the water and untreated water. And I felt very, very bad about it until I looked on the internet, and then I saw this one with that description: Groom drops bride into the museum pool. And so now it's out on the, so it's not just me, there are other people. Okay, so I don't feel too guilty now. But so that became a major expense point. And when I'm talking about the preservation, not having a preservation architect, that was a problem, because he didn't the original cost projections. He didn't know that there may be a Alberta health problem regulation with the water, and that the water needed to be treated. And that caught, I think, the team by surprise, and while the original fund was still there, it now went. It was over. It became quite a funding nightmare. And so now then we try to figure out what exactly is. So now it's a little bit of text. I apologize for that. But the architect and the engineers tried to figure out exactly what the regulations were. And so we explained that, the pool is an artistic sculpture and it's not intended for bathing, and will, comply with the regulations as a wading pool. And then Alberta Health, and this went on like for email and email and email. So then answered that they don't have any regulations for reflecting pools, and that, you know, as long as it's labeled and it's maintained for decorative purposes, it doesn't need all these, it doesn't need all the pool systems, even if a few people are waiting in it. Well, that was the response. I don't know if you can read that, but it went on and on. You know, it did talk about the filtration rate and the anti-entrapment and all of that, that I'm sure many people here will understand totally. And the response of the Alberta Health went back to saying, as I said before, you know, a wading pool does not blah, blah, blah. However, if you consider it a pool, then, you know, it went on, nobody would. So the architect, you know, it's not intended. But if we would leave any water in the pool, it would need to be designed to swimming pool standards. And so this is why we now have a fully treated pool, even though the water level is minimal. On the picture before you saw it was at least 12 to 18 inches high, and now I think it's down, the design is down to, you know, 4 inches. However, we have swimming pool quality system. So that went on. So then, you know, so then the project manager said, well, you know, we need the permit. We designed it for Alberta health regulations, even though it was never really clear if it needed that. And, you know, we've gotten all the approval if we need it or not. So it took a life on its own. And here we are with, so now when you saw before the, you know, the totem pole and the carriage house in the Tudor style and the petroglyphs, you know, so now we're getting a very large pump house. I just loved the, you know, the mechanical systems that were underground. Ours is now adjacent to the sculpture and it's basically the same size, more or less, little less. The sculpture itself was, it was really well constructed. The pool had, 12 inches of cement. There was nothing. It was perfect. The underlay, the rim around it, underneath the granite had been previously repaired. The plumbing had been repaired. Tiles were pulled out, and so and never put back together. So the water leaking and all this was really basically just bad repairs. And the tiles, that was my, those kind of things were my contribution. Really, it wasn't, we don't have this Delft style or 100-Wasser kind of swirly kind of design. The architect redesigned the pool, and we had some trouble finding something that matched the original tiles from the 1960s. Japanese tiles were absolutely beautiful. Bubble clays, very, very reflective. And we tried to get them reproduced, but it was simply too expensive. We couldn't afford that, and these are the Fujiwa that are similar. Okay, quickly, and here is one of the only original photograph during its construction. The steel and wire sculpture within in the old, and this is the new museum that's being built. And here we find the hatch to go into after we took the splash thing off. And this is the inside. And so the inside was actually fed. It looked dry. We had torrential rains. There was no water inside. There's the flash rusting. This is on the bottom. This is looking up. And now we could see how the bronzes were attached by rods, iron rods, painted, corrosion paint on top. And now it explained the copper staining on the outside. So this wasn't just from the interior of the bronze and the polyurethane. It was actually it corresponded to the fasteners. Okay, so our rest is the last slide. The cost estimate that we now have is for the removal of the bronzes, which is a bronze conservator, $10,000, and once they come off, then to remove the stucco and stucco the whole of the sculpture, and that was estimated $16,000. And so I want to thank the organizers for this excellent learning opportunity and for giving me the chance to present this work in progress.
We have time for one question before a break. Yes.
What kind of filtrate or fuel chemistry system did they go with?
Well, it's not, good question. It's not completed, and my co-author didn't give me that information. Zuehlke. I was not at work the last week because we had the river flood in a museum, so I couldn't press him on that.
So
I'm not
chosen anything yet, specifically?
No.
Just curious, because you have
Right.
problems with different systems too.
Yeah, I think it's chlorination. That was chlorination.
All right, so we're going to take a 15-minute break now. So we'll start back at.